again, we want to welcome you to the Rebella Accountancy Monthly Webinar. We are going to have a special guest speaker tonight, and I will turn the call over to Monica to do the introductions. Monica, welcome to the call.
Well, thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that, and welcome everyone listening. We have a special guest tonight, as Jeff mentioned. We have Dr. Michael Abernathy, who works with dentists around the country on transitioning and getting ready for retirement. Dr. Abernathy actually graduated from dental school at Baylor College in medicine in 1975. After graduating, he ran a highly effective and successful practice in McKinney, Texas for over 30 years. Toward the end of his career, he successfully was able to transition his practice to 3 other dentists and then retired. Dr. Abernathy now spends most of his time with dentists all over the country, talking to them and helping them understand their systems, their operations of their dental practice, as it's important, and how to get your practice set up for a transition and retirement. Dr. Abernathy works here locally in Southern California with Jonathan and Clark Moffitt. They run a practice called DDS Strategies in Southern California. Here is the background. Is Clark's dad, Jonathan's grandfather, was an orthodontist, and he retired, but he ended up living on his Social Security, and they've made it their mission to have no dentist that they work with ever have to be in that situation. So they work with Dr. Abernathy so that the doctors understand their practices, understand how to transition, and Clark and Jonathan help the doctors understand if they've got the retirement nest egg in hand, and that when those dates are, when it is appropriate for them to be able to retire and retire on their own terms. Dr. Abernathy, when he's not speaking, is writing books and articles, and he actually does a radio talk show. It's called Dental Doc Talk. It's a radio show that you can get on iTunes. And I'm now going to turn it over to our special speaker, Dr. Abernathy.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I wasn't really sure if most of the audience would be actually, getting ready for retirement or exiting completely or transitioning. And so we were talking about this before we got on the call and, what's the difference between a transition and a sale. And I'd probably look at it just a little bit differently than Monica might in that because we work with doctors that bring young doctors in or other doctors in to grow their practice, they also do the same when they get ready to transition and exit their practice too. And so as we're going through this, all of the strategies we're talking about will work for associates, trial partners, partnerships, and exit strategies. So it's pretty much the same. The idea being that we're kind of staging this to give you the best exit that you possibly can get, both in profit and less stress and things like that. So, I guess the first question most doctors I get from most doctors is, when should I do this? When should I consider a partner? When should I consider, starting this exit process? And generally, I tell them it needs to be done at least 5 years in advance. I mean, obviously, I get calls from doctors that go, I want to retire tomorrow with $4 million in cash, and I haven't saved a penny, and I've successfully ended 3 marriages, and that's not going to be possible. And so let's take a look here and see if I can kind of spell out things that would help you get ready and help you understand when you might be ready for a transition. Basically, and I'm going to kind of juxtapose this just a little bit in that I think sometimes doctors do this because they're burned out, bored, and just it's just not good for them. The practice isn't. So I'm assuming that everybody on this call is emotionally, physically able to bring another doctor into their practice, and they're ready to do so. One of the things you need to remember is that the senior doctor, and that would be the seller, is still ready to grow the practice. I mean, if you're going to bring somebody in, part of staging this for it to work well, depending on how long you're going to do this in advance, is your ability to still be emotionally engaged in the practice, financially committed to the practice, and posing and really staging this in such a way that you're not using this transition just as a burnout strategy. Okay, so your schedule ought to be full. In fact, I see so many doctors that start this transition process when maybe all they should do is just sell the practice and leave, thinking that bringing a doctor in will actually fill their schedule, and it won't. You've got to have a full schedule. I mean, if you're bringing a doctor in, I think the young doctors and certainly the bankers and accountants have gotten so much more proactive about looking at these practices in a way that, is there value there? And so, again, we need to, and when I say stage this, I don't know if anybody's ever watched HGTV, but my wife loved it. Staging is that, they'll have a show where they've been trying to sell this house for, 6 months and nobody's even looked at it. And it's a Greek family with lawn furniture in the living room, and it smells like Greek food or whatever it is, and they can't find anybody to buy it. And then this cute little English lady comes in, they repaint it, rent some furniture, do it, and they sell it for twice what it was worth, when they put it on the market, and they do it in a week. Okay, that's what I'm talking about when staging. So you've got to be ready and poised for growth. Now, again, I think when we look at the stages of a practice, we start out in kind of survival. And then probably the most fun part of the practice is that next stage where it's growth. But at some point, and maybe through several points in your career, you will hit plateaus. And then let's say you hire another hygienist and your production goes up. You add a different service, it goes up. And then finally you hire that doctor. So again, once you reach a plateau, that's when you're ready to bring somebody in. And let me give you a benchmark for a plateau. If you can't get patients in within 4 to 10 days, not 4 to 10 work days, but just 4 to 10 days during a peak demand time, and that would be about 7 to 9 and 3 to 5 or 6, 5 days a week, and Saturday. Anytime Saturday is a peak demand time. If whatever your schedule is, if you can't get a hygiene new patient in 4 to 10 days, you've plateaued. Another time to consider a transition is where you're really tired, but you're still poised for that growth. And I want to take and kind of go over a few benchmarks of really a really well-run general practice. Monica and I haven't talked about this before, but when I look at practices, I think there's a misconception about what brings value to a practice. And basically, I think for me, and I buy a lot of practices, buy, sell practices, own practices, sold practices, all over the United States. What brings value is your overhead, the hygiene department, to the buyer that I hope there's an upside to it, the number of new patients, the style of the practice, and the demographics of where you live. I think it's interesting because when we look at dental practices, everything's changed outside of our practices except us. Age, race, demographics, income levels, educational levels. I mean, everything changes, and this will either help your practice or adversely affect it. So overhead is huge. I mean, consider it. If we had two practices, one with a 50% overhead and one with a 70% overhead, both producing the same, both selling for the same amount, which would you want? Well, of course you want the 50% overhead. You need to consider that whatever your overhead is, and the national average is 67 to 75%. And I see a lot of practices that are far over that. I mean, large producing practices, they're in their 80, 85% range. So that's not ideal because when banks look at the value of your practice, when buyers look at it, when associates look at it, as an associate leading a partnership, leading to a buyout over a period of time, overhead is huge. I mean, if you have to make $2 to get 50 cents, that's pretty good. You got to make $3, $4, $5 to make $1. That gets pretty scary. And so when you sell your practice, whatever that price ends up being, keep in mind that the overhead is going to go up based on whatever that payment or servicing that debt is that doctor's going to be. That overhead plus that loan. And oftentimes banks will look at that and say that's untenable for the young doctor. We've got to have lots of new patients. Now, the national average is 25 to 30 new patients per month. And granted, I mean, if you're in a boutique practice and you just have a few, or if you're in a, a welfare Medicaid type of practice, you're going to have a whole lot. But it's interesting when you look at this, you have to be poised for growth to bring a doctor in. And that means you can't just have what the average doctor has, new patients. You got to have more. And the reason for that is that if you bring in a young doctor into your practice and you both are practicing there, even if you cut back, and let's say there's 20 new patients, you just divided that practice in half. And we need, if you have 40 new patients and you're worn out and you can't get people in, at least we know that you have the ability to market and attract an unlimited flow of patients, which makes it really tenable for a new doctor to come in and make a living. The age of the practice. Now, we have a lot of doctors that have multiple practices that we started out from scratch, and within 4 or 5 years they have 2 or 3 practices. We have a lot of older doctors that end up, transitioning it late in life. But I think there's a sweet spot in this. And for a senior doctor, once they get into their 60s, oftentimes they're coasting. They've plateaued, and they're thinking, I don't want to invest in those digital x-rays. I don't want to spruce up the office. You've got to consider when there's a potential buyer and they walk in and you've got paper charts, these young doctors have never even seen a paper chart. I mean, if they've been out for 10 years, they've probably never seen a paper chart. They're going to think your practice is a dinosaur. So, again, kind of like HGTV, you don't want to put in a swimming pool at your house because that's going to, lower the value of it. But you do some work in the kitchen or you do in the master bath and it's going to make a big difference. That's kind of what you're doing here. You're staging it to make this, get you the maximum dollar, greatest return on your investment. Recall. I don't think most doctors understand this. The average recall is 42%. Really good practice will have it in the 80% range. But from the value of a practice, it gives it, what's it worth? Why is it worth more money than another practice? It's hygiene recall. New patients first, then hygiene recall. 67% of all the dentistry that you're going to do or the young dentist will do comes out of hygiene recall. And so when we look at a boutique practice that does everything and they have very few new patients, there's nothing coming out of hygiene, and generally a boutique practice sells for the lowest percentage of production of any other type of practice. So we have Medicaid, a GP. Medicaid practice will sell for darn near 90, 80, 100% of what they produced in the last year because it's 100% transferable. If I bought that practice on Friday, on Monday, I'm going to still make the same amount. When I buy the boutique practice, oftentimes it's an older doctor, very charismatic, great clinical skills, has a rapport with their patients, and since most doctors track patients about 10 years on either side of their age, it's not as transferable. And then the GP practice will lean, one direction or the other. You've got to have at least about 2,000 active patients. We already know that when a broker does this, they consider active patients to be 24 months. I consider active patients, and I think most people that are in the know consider active patients to be patients that have been in the last 12 months. Our culture has become much more nomadic, and if they're not there now, they're not going to be there after they sell the practice. I like practices that have a growth, at least 15% a year. Now, factor into that we've had over the last 3 or 4 years at least an inflation rate of somewhere between 1 and 3%. So a 15% growth rate isn't that much, but no one wants to buy a practice where if we go back and look for 3 years, it was, 700,000, then 600, and now it's down to 500,000. I'm probably going to base the value on the most recent year rather on the spread of the 3 years because whatever it is, your practices are not poised to be successful in any environment. And again, the last one is debt structure. Again, I think it's a mistake it would be, to really bring a partner in or an associate where we're looking towards the finish line here, assuming that they're going to bail you out from a debt standpoint. They're not purchasing their debt when you sell your practice, and again, at some point, especially if you're in your late 50s and 60s and 70s, there should be no debt, and the practice should be, look very, very attractive. So let's look at overhead here just a second.
Could I ask you just a question before we move forward? A couple questions. The first is, I don't think most doctors know what their overhead is, and I did a seminar for my webinar on that, as to really drive into how do you figure out your overhead. But I agree. 63% is actually a bit high. I would like to see it lower than that.
Absolutely.
But you made a comment about, the HGTV, and hey, if you've got paper charts, you really need to transition. You need to get maybe into digital X-rays. You need to modernize your systems. I think that 5 years before retirement, starting to put a lot of money into that can be very expensive, and they may not get it out when they sell. So where along this time frame do you think that they should start doing that? 10 years out?
Well, I mean, keep in mind, when we value practice, if you do a certified appraisal, the age of the equipment will only affect the purchase price about 3 to 5%.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the psychology of selling is, if they walk in and this looks like a dinosaur, you've got to factor into the price that we had a federal mandate over a year ago. It eclipsed and came back to last January. Everything we file has to be digital now. And so if you're taking analog X-rays, you've got to digitize them or scan them to send them to insurance companies. I mean, it's getting where the standard of care, and that's established not by law, but by the majority of people doing it. Standard of care, is having digital X-rays. Again, I bet in 10 years it'll be 3D X-rays. Okay, but when I look at this, I'm going to tell the young doctor, look, you're going to have to put 30 or 40,000, maybe as much as 60,000 in just to upgrade the technology.
Mm-hmm.
We look at your software, and again, if you've got some antiquated first-year software and it hadn't been updated, so you can't transfer software. If you're going to sell it, the doctor's got to buy brand new software.
Mm-hmm.
They can't inherit your software, so that goes into the price. And so I'm just saying, when you look at this, the good thing about selling a practice today is that 7 or 8 years ago, we had 3,000 students graduating from dental school every year, but we had 6,000 doctors retiring. So there were a lot of practices to be bought. Now, after 3 recessions, we now have 5,200 graduates from dental school with debt of $350,000 to $540,000 a year. I mean, total school debt, and they come out. They're going to have to buy a practice that will generate enough income that they can service several debts. And so, again, at least there's not as many practices out there being sold, and so you can garner a higher price if you have somebody that can qualify for it. And that's going to be the problem.
So are you telling the doctor that, you have to keep in mind, if you're not going to modernize, it's going to affect your price? But my question was, I think it's beyond 5 years out. I mean, if they're going to spend some serious money, I think it's, 6 or 7 years out, because it's costly. It can be very costly.
It can be, but again, I think, and we're getting ready to bump heads, I think, Monica, because, which is fine. I look at this at, why would you want to spend the next 5 years practicing 30-year-old dentistry?
No, I get it. And okay. I agree, but they just have to consider it as part of their price. If you don't,
it does, and you're looking at it as amortizing that depreciation out over the useful life of the deal. But we still have Section 179 of the IRS Code. It is expensive, but if we look at the contribution of that particular aspect of our tax law, you might find that this isn't going to be as expensive as you might think. And let's say, for example, and this is a ludicrous example, but let's say they bought an E4D or a CEREC machine, which, $100,000, okay? And I have seen sales where it was being leased, where the lease was transferable and the young doctor wanted it, and was willing to take on that lease, and it didn't affect the purchase price at all. So, so I think it's an individual deal, and I think we need to look at it. But you're right. There's probably a balance in there, and we were talking about this on email. I think the biggest mistake doctors make is thinking that this sale of this practice is going to fund their retirement. If you really look at it, I've seldom seen a practice sell for more than 2 times its net for the last year. And so if that were true, if you work 2 more years, not only would it decrease the amount of retirement income you'd need, but you could actually walk away from the practice and have the same amount of money. Right. So I hate to tell doctors that are right at this moment thinking about retirement, but I'm hoping there's some younger doctors on here too that they need to understand that they need to save about 20% a year for their entire career.
There you go. Okay, well, I don't want to hold you back, so I'm going to let you go.
No, you're not going to hold me back, and I'll start talking Pentecostal if we get behind here. So I'm trying to watch the clock, and now this preview of this ideal overhead, again, would give you an overhead in the 55%. And Monica said, I'd rather see them lower than 63, but I think there is a balance in that too. I've never owned a practice that had over about a 53% overhead. So it is possible still today you have overhead. But I think the biggest violator of this is generally staff compensation. There is a website. It's called Indeed, INDEED.com. When we're looking at purchasing a practice, one of the things we're looking at is, do we have a key person in there that's overpaid? Overpaid to the point that it's not even the realm of somebody. I mean, I don't know if there's some type of relationship going on. I don't know if it's a longevity-based raise, but you look at it and it's 3 times what they should be making. And so it's not unusual for you to see staff compensation in the 30 to 40% range, and that will surely adversely affect the value of your practice, especially to a young doctor when they're looking at servicing a debt. So this is just an outline here. Staff compensation can be anything you spend on staff. I mean, anything. Taxes, continuing education, pizzas for a staff meeting, any benefits, anything. Facility, and again, I know from an accounting standpoint, this is a poor way of looking at it, but Monica, I don't think most doctors even understand their profit and loss statement.
No, clearly not. And
okay, I mean, and it's truly not a profit and loss. I mean, I guess a cash flow statement would be much closer to showing them their actual overhead, income versus spending. And because the profit and loss does not show debt service in there. It shows the interest, but it doesn't show the debt service. So, again, this is a very easy way, and I think regardless of your accounting techniques, I think everybody should have a monthly cash flow statement, profit and loss statement, whatever you want to call it, that looks at the percentages. I don't care about the numbers, the dollar amount, but so at an easy glance, they can see these things and go, my overhead is in the range I want to keep it in.
Yep.
And so, again, let's go on to the next slide on ideal benchmarks. We've already talked about the number of new patients, but let me talk about demographics here just a second. I wish we had, a live feed here so I could pull up any zip code, maybe where Monica's office is, and walk you through demographics. But it's real important that we know the educational level, the unemployed and below poverty, because oftentimes when we look in California, it'll be 15 to 23% unemployed. If we add in the people that are working part-time, it's well over that. And this increases or decreases the value of the practice. So when we look at demographics, we need about 2,000 potential clients per one dentist, or it's going to be difficult to grow it. And so from a buyer's perspective, they're looking for an upside. And and again, I'm making it sound like California is horrible. I'm in McKinney, Texas, about 35 miles from Dallas, bedroom community. The very best ratio in McKinney is 1 dentist for 125 people. In the town 5 miles away from me, it's 1 per 64. The average age is 32, and they've got 2.1 children. You tell me how you're going to make a living there. Okay. So, again, in selling a practice, if that ratio is bad, if it's challenging, 1 to 1,000, it will affect the value of your practice. Pricing. When's the last time you raised your fees, guys, gals? I mean, and I'd be glad to send you fee schedules for your zip codes if you'll just email me. But, when is the last time you raised your fees? This is huge, and over the time of your practice, it could mean, hundreds of thousands of dollars. The 325 square feet is one of the things I have young doctors. I have a list of things I have young doctors look at senior doctors' practices when they're thinking about buying in. And that is the ratio of the number of office square feet. And so this is not 325 square feet per op. It's, if I divide the number of ops, let's say we had 10 ops and we had 4,000 square feet, that would be 400 square feet per op. I see offices that have, there's one in Allen, Texas, that is 1,100 square feet per op. What that creates is such a millstone of overhead for that practice, that nut to break every month, that it's ridiculous. So I try to get them to keep it below 400. Production. Okay, now let's say we have a 5-op office. In a really well-run practice, and I'm talking 50% overhead, all these other great things, they should be producing around 25 to 30,000 per op. So let's say total of 5 ops, then that's going to be, 125 to 150 a month. Now, let's say you're not doing that, but you have the 5 ops. It doesn't mean that you're a loser. What it means is there's not a physical capacity problem in your practice. You can produce more than you're currently producing with the facility you have. Production per staff person, 20 to 25,000 per month. Again, back to the same thing we talked about when we're looking at overhead being compensation. Most practices are either underproducing or overstaffed, okay? And that's not great. So hygiene. Now, this is another thing that makes practices worth money. Hygiene department, whether there's 10 hygienists or 1, should be doing about a third of the total production. If they're not, you're missing a huge asset in your practice, by partnering with hygiene to make this do better. Again, we try to make sure that hygienists are producing at least 3 times what they're paid. And then in an ideal situation, we talked about staging this, where the doctor was really busy and tired and they were having trouble getting patients in. Again, I want to see twice as many hygiene hours as doctors' hours. Make a huge, huge difference in the profitability of the practice. 60% of production is substantial cases. Let's say, and I know it's more than this in California, but just so I can do this in my head real quick. Let's say your goal for the doctor per day was $5,000. 60% of your day, or $3,000, has to be in or about the fee of what a crown was. So that'd be $1,000. That doesn't have to be a crown, but it's got to be in a substantial case. It could be in, root canal buildup, an implant, 8 extractions, 3 or 4 fillings, whatever, but you just can't have a productive practice unless 60% of your production is in substantial cases. At least a 98% collection rate. And again, in all the practices we work with, I can't think of one that has less than 104%. With outside financing, and Care Credit is not the one I would use. It would be one of the ones I use, not the one I use. But with outside financing, 98% would be minimal. And then recall. We already talked about it. 60% of what you're going to do is going to come out of hygiene recall. National average is 42%. Again, you look at an 85% recall, and this is really easy to pull off your management software in your offices. It'll show number of patients that have appointments, what they don't. It'll show the ages, the zip codes they come from, who has insurance, who doesn't, and the ratio of male to female. All of these things are important to actually know. Now, Monica, you emailed me about this next slide on independent contractor. I apologize. I didn't even know it was in there. But I have a lot of doctors that they want me to look at either design, associate contract, or look at something. And you're right. I mean, the point I was making here is that there's absolutely no way in an audit that you're going to float past having another general practitioner in your practice and have them qualify as an independent contractor.
Yeah, it just doesn't exist anymore, and so those
Exactly.
doctors still treating all their associates as independent contractors are at huge risk.
Well, and it's really bad because the average stay for an associate in a practice is 15 to 24 months, and every one of them that leaves is upset at you.
Yeah.
So all they have to do is not pay their taxes and then report you. And I've seen hundreds of thousands of dollars of problems created by using an independent contracting status. And so just don't do it, okay? Instead of Nike, just do it. We'll just not do it, okay? So, okay, where do you look for doctors, okay? I've got a list of them here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I want to show you a couple of them that I think work extremely well. Okay, I mean, you can read this as well as I can, but I want to suggest that every dental school in the United States, and we've got dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of dental schools now, not just the ones in California, because students matriculate towards a school they can get into. I was talking at San Antonio about 3 or 4 months ago, and 30% of the class was from Utah. Utah just started 2 new dental schools this year. So they have digital bulletin boards, and you can put an ad in all the dental schools real quickly, and it doesn't cost you a penny. And what's interesting about this is that it's not just recent graduates that look at it, because I know what you're thinking. I don't want a graduate in my office and blah, blah, blah. But they'll go back, and as long as they graduated from there, they can access that digital bulletin board, and they are constantly looking. Okay, and so that's a good location. Your local supplier, like Patterson, Shine, Benco, whoever they are, they're in offices, and a lot of times associates that are in other offices are not happy, or they're in a corporate practice and they're not happy. They're asking, if anybody's looking to sell their practice, is anybody looking to, associate, or anybody looking for a transition? That's a great place to look. California Craigslist works okay, but by far the very, very best way to do it is direct mail. And California is a little bit tougher to do this, but 39 states in the United States are open record states. And so we can actually get all of the addresses of the dentist in our area that, let's say, have been out from 1 to 4 years, and we send a letter directly to them. By far, you will get the highest quality of candidate than you will any other way, because the really good doctors are working. They're working hard. They're looking on Craigslist or want ads in a dental journal, and again, they get this letter, come visit, you make your case for them, and a lot of them are excited to move on down the road and take a look at this. So makes a huge, huge, huge difference. I mentioned the corporate practices, but, I mean, I've done this before. I've walked into a Castle or Monarch or Pacific Dental and just walked in there and grabbed the business cards of all the dentists and made some calls and asked them if they were tired of working there, if they'd be interested. So made a huge difference in the quality of doctors that I was able, to attract. Let's talk about what your practice is worth. Now, again, I want you to understand there are various ways to transition. There's various ways to sell a practice. And so when we look at this, let's start with the end in mind, like Stephen Covey says, the 7 habits of highly effective people. bottom line is this practice will sell what you're willing to sell it for and the buyer's willing to pay for it. And so it sometimes will sell for more than an appraisal. Oftentimes it'll sell for less than the appraisal. And a lot of this is predicated on, a reasonable price based on factors that will get them past a banker financing it. And there's various ways to finance this too. So I'll run through several of these real quick. There's an old myth that practices are worth about 65 to 70% of their last 12-month collections. It still fits a little bit, but it varies so much from area to area. And so that's not a realistic way of looking at it. I think probably the only realistic way is a certified appraisal. But again, I have never seen a practice sell for more than about 2 times net over the last 12 months. It is so far out of the realm of being able to service that note that most banks won't touch it without some type of endorsement, or the doctor taking on a portion, the selling doctor taking on a portion of the note. The certified appraisals are going to be the best way, and there are a lot of people out there that do those. Monica, do you do certified appraisals?
No, I don't. In Southern California, we have so many practices that are for sale that I haven't actually ever seen one in 15 years.
Well, most banks will require a certified appraisal, and again, they either have it internally or they require it externally. What I find, though, is when we look at buyers and sellers, there's a particular dynamic that occurs here, and in that you can stage this where this is not necessary, but again, if we start involving lending institutions, they're going to look at this real hard, and they're going to come up with their own appraisal. Generally, these things are going to cost, I don't know, if Shine has gotten into the business too, and $2,000, $2,500 to do it. If it's good and it makes, it supports the price you want, it might be worth that.
Well, I actually, the bankers cash flow it. Now, if they have somebody internally that comes in and says, here's what we think it's worth based upon a cash flow, they might do that. But, in 15 years, there isn't anyone in Southern California that does certified appraisals. They just aren't something that are part of the sale if they're going through a broker.
Okay. Well, I know 10 or 12 that do that in California, and I see sales all the time where it has been involved. But again, I'm just saying, how do you start at a possible price for it? So when you talk to clients, Monica, and they're going, Monica, I've been thinking about selling my practice, and I'm kind of wondering, what do you think it's worth? What do you tell them?
The thing that I tell them is, one is we need to look and see, what your overhead is. I mean, are you in a good place that it'd be attractive for somebody? The next is we look at, here's an old rule of thumb, but that doesn't mean that's what you're going to get, because we really need to see what is really in the practice to see, what the buyer might be attracted to. But there's 2 ways. It's a top, you look at the top with revenues, and you also look what it nets. Your revenues
okay.
Good.
So let's go back to the overhead. That was the first one you said. Let's look at your overhead.
Right.
So when you're talking to your clients, what are you pushing them towards in an overhead? I mean, ideally.
The biggest thing that I push them for with overhead is to make sure we understand what true overhead is, because there's things that get into the profit and loss that aren't necessarily the real running of the practice. So push them forward.
So you clean up the numbers, right?
Up the numbers. Let's understand how much it costs to really run the practice. So let's get there first. And then once we get there, we can start looking at the percentages. When I do my financial statements, they get percentages every month or quarter or whatever period of time we're doing it for them. They know what their percentages are. And when I'm doing an analysis for them once a year or twice a year, I look at those percentages and I let them know, are you within a range? Here's where you need to start focusing.
Why don't we do this? Let's consider, since we've got a little bit of time here, let's consider mistakes that you have seen and that I have seen in starting this process or even carrying it to fruition. And we can do dueling mistakes. I mean, you could probably do this for 3 hours, because about the time I think there's every mistake, I've seen every mistake, I'm going, oh my gosh, I can't believe this guy did this, okay? So I think a huge mistake is not involving your staff early in this transition. I don't mean, telling that you're going to sell it, but they're an integral part into making a transition and an exit strategy work real well for the buying doctor. And I think most staffs are mature enough to understand if you're they can tell, it doesn't matter what your age is, but if you're going to exit dentistry, you're going to sell your practice at some point, whether it's now or 5 years from now, they kind of know their future is being held in a balance by the buying doctor at some point. So if you're bringing somebody in, it's going to be an associateship leading to partnership or a buy-in, buy-out kind of situation. I see doctors where I want to visit the practice. I'm going to buy the practice. And the doctor says, well, the only time I can do it is 8 o'clock at night. And I'm going, I don't understand. He said, well, I haven't told the staff that I'm interested in transitioning at all. So tell me what you think about that.
I think that doing a proper transition, I agree with you. I mean, everyone should be on board. And like you said, the doctor should still be actively doing dentistry and engaged in his practice. And if he's doing that, everyone should be on board that they want to make it a better practice. What I see is that the doctors get to the point where they're burned out.
Yeah.
They think they can just bring somebody on and they can sell within a year, and that's transition to them. And that's not what we're talking about here.
Exactly. So the next thing would be let me just say this and then I'll tell you why I said it. You never hire anybody you can't fire. Okay, that could be a wife or a spouse, and I see this very often where have a female doctor and then her husband is an engineer, but he's managing the practice, or a male doctor whose wife is the office manager. Consider that in a transition, at some point, the doctor you bring in is not going to want another family member there, or there's a possibility that's going to be the case. And I see that go along, and then they're just totally taken by surprise that the young doctor doesn't want the office manager being your wife or your daughter or something like that. So have you ever seen that before?
A lot.
Okay. So, it's just something that you need to be proactive about the possibility of dealing with, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Another problem I see is that oftentimes you have a problem in your practice. And again, it could be a staff person. It could be, I think as I've gotten older, and I'm 65, okay, so as I got older in my practice after practicing almost 40 years, I probably got a little more, less confrontational and a little more tender-hearted, and maybe some things I let slide with staff issues. And I truly believe what you allow, you encourage. But when you bring another doctor in, I think the only right way to do this is you to deal with the problems. Or let's say you find a buyer and you're just going to sell and leave. I'm going to insist, if I buy your practice, that you let that person go before I even get there. Have you ever seen something like that in staffing issues?
Well, again, I think a lot of dentists are very soft-hearted. I think right where you are.
Nice people.
They are nice people, and they see the redeeming qualities in everybody, and they don't want to have the tough conversations. Okay?
Exactly.
So I think there's a lot of problems in most dental practices because they don't want to have those conversations. So I would agree with you. Those people have to be cleaned up. The practice have to be cleaned up before you bring somebody else on, or they're going to point it out to you right away and want you to fix it. So you do need to do that. But the other thing I'd say, and maybe you've seen this too, is the doctor is running the practice. He's got a great practice. He's going to bring an associate on, and that associate on, this is going to be the person that they're going to transition with. what I see happening way too late is giving responsibility to that associate dentist, getting them involved in the management of the practice. It happens so late that that is what really I think has a problem with the transition is they're not ready, they don't have the skills, they haven't been managing, and the staff haven't respected them to take on that role. Have you seen that?
Yes, and this is why we don't do associateships when we're talking about this type of a transition or exit strategy. The contract's very similar, but we call them a trial partner.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the purpose being is that they need to be treated as a 50-50 partner. I don't care, what percentage they're buying or whatever, but they need to be involved. I'll tell you one other thing. I've never seen a doctor do this. We do this in every transition that I've ever done when I brought them into a practice, is that I interview them. I get it down to 2 or 3 candidates. The staff interviews them and takes them out for drinks or hors d'oeuvres, and I don't go with them. We finally get it down to 1, but I never let the doctor come in and work as a doctor. They come in and they work every position in the office until the best person at my front desk says he knows how to schedule, he knows how to use his phone, he understands the software. Then he cleans teeth, or she cleans teeth, until my main hygienist goes, the doctor can clean teeth, they can treatment plan, they can, triage the patient, they're blah, blah, blah. Then they assist. They go through every position. Might take a week, might take 2 weeks, but at the end of the 2 weeks, then the staff decides whether the doctor stays. Now, let me tell you the dynamic that creates. One, we didn't bring some snot-nosed young doctor in there that your staff literally will cut their legs out from under them if you're not careful. But they came in and they earned the respect of the staff, and now the staff, when they say, this is the person we want in here working with us, they have a vested interest in to see them succeed rather than being disengaged and sabotaging their success. The other thing, too, is on a Saturday or hours where they're working and you're not working, they're going to know the office better than you do. And, again, that's pretty radical, but it works every time. Okay? There is one other thing I want to mention, and because I mentioned this several times, where I said, when doctors look at a practice, they're looking at an upside. And I want to make sure that these senior doctors understand what an upside is to a buyer. And it won't take 2 or 3 minutes, but let me just run through these. One, if you're working Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, you certainly pick the very hours absolutely no one would come in. But there's a real upside for a young doctor because if he works Fridays and Saturdays, he'll have the lion's share of the new patients. He'll build the practice real quick. There's a huge ability for him to increase the productivity of the practice and have an earning potential. It'll look like great value to them. Let's say that you only have, 10, 15 new patients, and you don't market, but of those 15 patients, they're all direct referrals. It means you're doing everything right, but you're not investing in letting people know who and where you are. That's a huge upside for the doctor, because if you're not marketing, if they do market, now they're going to fit in their budget, but if they do market, it's going to make a difference for them. Let's say you don't take any insurance. And again, Monica, I actually looked up the address for your office and looked at your zip code. 74% of the people in your zip code have some form of dental insurance. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not saying anything about insurance, good or bad. I'm just saying if you don't take insurance and there's a potential for the young doctor to do it, that's a huge upside for them for quadrupling the new patients, doing. Let's say you don't do certain procedures. You don't do your molar root canals. You don't do oral surgery. You don't like seeing kids. Your hours are any of those things are huge upsides for a buyer, and they look at this at improving their position regardless of what they pay for it, but they're much more likely to pay that for it. Now, one last thing that is an upside, and this is going to sound, and I don't know that I'm going to explain this right, so Monica, you may have to help me here. If I went out and started a practice from scratch, it's going to cost me around, give or take, $320,000 to $400,000 for about a 1,800 to 2,000 square foot office with 6 ops. I'm only going to equip a portion of them, or I'll equip all of them with used equipment that's been refurbished. I'll have a little money left over if I have some contribution with the landlord and build out. But when you look at the price of practicing, if you have a practice and you've just kind of let it dwindle down to $400,000 or $500,000 a year or something like that, and you're just going to sell it, you probably going to get a larger percentage of your production than a practice that's doing $2 million. Because I think there's a level or a price point at which, dude, it's going to cost you $350,000 to even get into the game. So let's say that practice is only worth $200 on a piece of paper, but it will sell for a lot more than that if it's got some usable operatories and a few patients, because it gets them into the game. The leasehold improvements are paid for. I mean, have you seen that happen before?
I haven't seen it go for a premium. What I've seen is that they get snatched up. That there's kind of this sweet spot of where there are seven buyers that want to buy, and it's between $250 and $450. And it's the sweet spot, because it's exactly what you said. It's like, hey, dude, if you wanted to build from scratch, if you wanted to open a place and start it, it's going to cost you $350,000. You got patients here, you got revenue, and you got a practice ready to go.
And we've got hygiene.
And we got
recall.
So it's just that sweet spot of where people want to be. But there's a big difference between fee-for-service and insurance and a capitation program. It just depends on, and location, geographic.
And we'd probably disagree about the fee-for-service, the insurance. Actually, the best practices I see, I mean, like doing $1 million a month, they all have overheads over, less than 55%, and they take every insurance.
I don't think it's a bad thing. I think there's just different
ways. No, but I mean, you either outrun them or outgun them. The only way to make money in managed care, but it's a different animal, and I think this change has been inherent in dentistry and healthcare for the last, 30 years, and it's accelerating, and, so anyway.
Yep. And the younger dentists get it. They really do. They know things are going to change, and so they do look at that, and it's exactly what you said. So you have some way to go find the population in your zip code, what percentage of that population's carrying insurance, dental insurance. Wow.
I do. It's a software that you can purchase to do that. But again, I think, I look for practices all the time, either for myself or other doctors. And it is more science than art. And I can give them spreadsheets to look at, and if they can knock down certain things, 20 or 30 things, and then get most of them, it's a good buy, and you can't go wrong with it. And I'm telling these doctors, hey, if it's $50,000 difference and it's a good buy, don't even worry about it. You're going to make it back in the first 6 months.
Right.
And it's not worth losing it, And but again, a lot of this is positioning this, staging in such a way that what you're selling is attractive to a buyer. Even the way you present the numbers to them. And this isn't. My wife grew up in a farming family, and I learned to negotiate from my father-in-law. And again, if you're selling a practice and there's something that's not attractive about it, or you're selling a car and something not, point that out first. Don't let them discover it. Disarm them and show them, okay, now this is blah, blah. They'll stop looking. And then give them or couch the numbers in such a way that you give them the good things to look at first. Now, if they ask for certain things, great, you can get them. And you're not going to you're not trying to color the numbers, but you want to put your best foot forward.
Well, the information you have given on this webinar has been fantastic. Thank you so much for.
You're welcome. And Monica, on this last slide, that Blog Talk Radio, I did 4 or 5 programs about a year and a half ago on transitions. So it's going to be 4 or 5 hours, and it goes into great detail on how to find these things. So it's an easy way to find it, get more information. So and if they have any questions, they can call me. Okay.
Well, you're very kind to have a phone number, and I think the Blog Talk Radio, I think, is going to give them lots of information.
Good.
But this is just whetting their appetite. They're going to definitely want to look at some more in this and definitely research it a bit more, because transition's not for everyone. If you've got a $400,000 practice, I don't know if transition's going to be for them. But
I had one doctor that, again, it was partly him instead of a she. But partly his fault that he didn't have the money to retire on, but he was emotionally burned out. And so I kind of got him to kind of retire in practice. We sold the practice, but he kept 2% of it. so it was a stock transfer in his corporation, so it minimized the tax. But what he ended up doing is he worked a Monday, and all he did was, I can't remember if it was ortho or implants, but he'd come in and work on 4 or 5 plants, something the other doctor didn't want. He worked on Monday, and he didn't work for 2 weeks, and then he worked on a Friday. Then he worked the next Monday, didn't work for 2 weeks, and worked on a Friday. So he worked 4 days a week and netted a little over $100,000 a year doing that, and he paid his assistant, who kind of grew up and retired with him, just enough to help him, and loved doing what he was doing. And then 5 or 6 years after that, it might have been 7, he just gave the young doctor the other 2%. And if he hadn't given it to him, they had a formula that it was just a minimal cost for the last 2%. It was a great retirement for him. So.
And he did such high-end work that the 98% partner really wasn't at that skill level? That was the idea?
No, well, a lot of times these general practitioners that come out and they're young, they don't place their own implants, or they don't do. This guy was doing 6-month smiles, as I remember.
Okay.
But which is basically cosmetic ortho. And again, the doctor offered to show him, but the guy was so busy in the practice, doing the kids and doing the adults and doing the grandparents and doing everything else, it was just an adjunct to his practice, and they worked out a deal where, it worked out real well for him. So, again, I think doctors forget that you just can't retire. When we talk about transitions, you also have to transition into being a civilian. And having done this, I think the biggest difficulty I've had in doing this is not having people bring me problems. And so you have to transition to something. And so, again, I think the psychology of a transition or exit strategy, is a whole different deal. And I see doctors that are unhappy. And the last thing, my dad was 80-something. He's an attorney. I come from 7th-generation attorney. He retired when he was 80-something, and he was in my dental chair, and he says, "Mike, I'm going to retire on Friday." And I'm going, "Oh, crap." I'm thinking to myself, have you told Mom? And he says, "Yep." She said I could come home anytime I wanted to after 5. And so, if you've been married for many years and, keep in mind, your wife isn't going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya for the rest of your life. And, it's a whole different shooting match when you do this. So.
Yeah, absolutely. You're not going to be able to follow them around to go to the shop.
Yeah. They got a life of their own. Right.
Yeah, they have a life, and they like their life of their own. So you've got to. Well, Michael, again, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It's just a pleasure, and I think what we're going to do is we're going to see if anybody who's listening live might have some questions and emailed. So, Jeff, are you back on to see if we have an email or any live questions?
You bet. The lines are open, so if you do have a question and you're listening live on the call tonight, just go ahead and ask your question, and Dr. Abernathy or Monica will answer it. And I'll check. It looks like we do not have any questions tonight from the Internet. And anybody on the phones? I don't hear anybody, so it sounds like we've answered all our questions. We did cover a lot of information. It was good.
I think
we didn't even scratch the surface, of this. But so
I think that they're confused. I think they're trying to digest it because it is just scratching at the surface for everybody. So,
well, I think the important thing is to take away from this is the big picture. We need to start with the end in mind. I mean, what do you want this to look like? Are you going to have enough money? How do you make this go well? But there's certain stumbling blocks and hurdles you need to crawl over. And being proactive of this means that it's not going to be stressful when you do it. And then just positioning this so that you have a successful, transition will make a huge difference. So, study it, ask your CPA, ask people that do it all the time so that you're ready to make this happen.
That sounds great. And again, thank you so much for being on the call and your time tonight and being available for those that might want to contact you. We appreciate it. And Jeff, any last things that we need to know?
No, I think we've got it. We do have a last slide on the book on transitions, Dr. Abernathy. If somebody is listening on the replay and they either want the book on transitions or they want to contact you, what's your best way to get a hold of you?
My email, and I think that was on the first slide. And it's just my last name, Abernathy, 2004 at yahoo.com.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again. Thank you, Jeff, for being with us and taking us through this, and have everyone have a great night. Thanks so much.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.